The sun had just begun its lazy climb over the quiet suburban street, casting a soft golden glow over neatly trimmed lawns and familiar driveways. For the protagonist, mornings like this were a chance to enjoy a little peace, a strong cup of coffee, and the calm satisfaction of owning and maintaining their home exactly as they liked it. Their property was a small masterpiece of order and personal style, flower beds bursting with color, a neatly paved walkway, and a trash can that, in their eyes, was perfectly functional and placed. But on the other side of the street, Corinne was already awake, clipboard in hand and determination in her step. Corinne was the type of neighbor who treated rules not as suggestions, but as guiding principles of life itself. She believed she had a personal mission to ensure every property met her exacting standards, from the angle of a garden gnome to the precise placement of a trash can. The protagonist had learned early on that Corinne's enthusiasm for standards often extended into meddling, though they preferred to think of it as peculiar persistence. Over the past few weeks, Corinne had developed a particular interest in the protagonist's trash can. Each morning, without fail, the can seemed to suffer some mysterious fate, tilted at an angle, nudged to the edge of the driveway, occasionally knocked over entirely. The first few times, the protagonist assumed it was accidents, wind, squirrels, or a rogue delivery truck. But soon it became clear that someone was behind the repeated incidents. Peering from the porch one morning, the protagonist caught sight of Corinne tiptoeing across the lawn, clipboard tucked under her arm, giving the trash can a subtle nudge. A faint shake of her head, an approving smile to herself, and then she disappeared back toward her driveway as if she'd performed an essential duty. Rather than confront Corinne directly, the protagonist decided patience and observation were the best tools. They had learned long ago that overreaction only encouraged people like Corinne. So, armed with coffee and a sense of quiet amusement, the protagonists simply straightened the trash can and continued their morning routine, making mental notes about the neighbor's schedule, methods, and peculiar expressions of satisfaction. It was during one of these quiet observation sessions that the protagonist realized something important. Corinne's timing was consistent, and her determination was predictable. She appeared just before garbage pickup, always with the same cheerful, self-satisfied expression, as if she were performing a noble community service. The protagonists smiled to themselves, realizing that understanding the patterns was half the battle. Despite the minor annoyances, the protagonist found humor in the situation. Corinne had an almost theatrical quality to her persistence, moving with exaggerated care and subtle pomp. Watching her from the porch, the protagonist couldn't help but imagine her as a character in a play, performing her self-appointed role as keeper of the neighborhood's standards. Neighbors, though aware of the subtle antics, tended to keep their distance, enjoying the quiet spectacle without interfering. Some whispered quietly about Corinne's obsession, others chuckled silently at her antics, and a few shared knowing smiles with the protagonist, recognizing their calm handling of the situation. The protagonist appreciated the support, even if indirect, and continued their morning with an air of calm confidence. As the week went on, the pattern became a game of observation. The protagonist learned to anticipate Corinne's moves, noting the precise moments she approached the trash can and predicting how she would manipulate it. They realized that rather than viewing the situation as frustrating, it could be transformed into an opportunity, a chance to plan, to respond with creativity, and to turn the tables in a way that would be entirely unexpected. By the end of the week, the protagonist had formulated a plan. Instead of simply enduring Corinne's interference, they would replace the trash can with something she could never have anticipated. It would be clever, functional, and above all, completely under the protagonist's control. For the first time, the quiet satisfaction of ownership mixed with the thrill of anticipation. The stage was set. Corinne, confident in her habitual routine, had no idea that her next encounter with the trash can would be unlike anything she had imagined. And the protagonist, calm and composed, knew that a clever solution was just around the corner, ready to transform a minor annoyance into a subtle, satisfying triumph. The following week, the protagonist noticed that Corinne's behavior had subtly intensified. It wasn't just the occasional nudge anymore. Now the trash can was frequently found completely tipped over, spilling its contents in neat, if slightly chaotic, piles. Leaves and papers scattered along the driveway served as a testament to Corinne's diligence, or perhaps her obsession. The protagonist, however, remained calm, brushing off the mess with a quiet smile and a sense of mild amusement. Corinne had become a predictable force of nature. Every morning, just as the sun peeked over the rooftops, she would emerge, clipboard in hand, scanning each property with her keen eye. And inevitably, she would find the protagonist's trash can. With delicate precision, she would give it a little shove or a subtle tilt, inspecting it from various angles as though she were grading a student on a final exam. Then, satisfied, or at least content in her own mind, she would retreat back to her house, likely to make a note of her contribution to neighborhood order. The protagonist, seated on the porch with a cup of coffee, started to document the incidents, not because they felt the need to escalate matters, but simply because it was fascinating to observe. Patterns emerged. Corinne favored Tuesdays and Thursdays for her most vigorous inspections, always in the morning, always when the light hit the driveway at a certain angle. She even had a signature approach, heels clicking against the sidewalk, clipboard tucked under one arm, eyes scanning for any imperfection. Neighbors, as usual, watched from a safe distance. Some exchanged knowing glances and subtle smiles, amused by the daily ritual that had become the protagonist's minor saga. Others whispered quietly about Corinne's persistence, admiring the protagonist's patience and self-control. One neighbor even joked softly, "She's like the neighborhood's own inspector general, but somehow the trash can is her main mission." The protagonist chuckled silently to themselves, appreciating the humor in the situation while remaining undisturbed. The protagonist began to think strategically. If Corinne was predictable and her timing precise, then her actions could be anticipated, and with the right preparation cleverly countered. They started to sketch ideas, imagining a replacement for the trash can that would surprise Corinne, disarm her usual tactics, and perhaps even leave her momentarily speechless. It wasn't about revenge. It was about creativity, subtle humor, and the quiet satisfaction of having the upper hand without confrontation. One afternoon, the protagonist experimented with minor adjustments. They reinforced the bottom of the trash can, added subtle weights, and tested various placements along the driveway. Each change seemed innocuous, yet each one brought a slight shift in how Corinne's nudges affected the can. The protagonist noted which adjustments made her pushes less effective and which produced amusing reactions, like the can wobbling slightly but never tipping over entirely. By midweek, the protagonist had a clear plan forming. They would replace the current trash can with something entirely unexpected. It would be functional, durable, and designed to withstand Corinne's persistence. More importantly, it would be clever, a small but undeniable statement that the protagonist was in control of their property while still respecting the neighborhood's spirit. Meanwhile, Corinne continued her routine, blissfully unaware that her daily ritual was about to be disrupted. She approached the driveway with her usual confidence, prepared to perform her careful inspection, and likely expecting the same minor frustrations she had so far. The protagonist, sitting calmly on the porch, observed with mild amusement, savoring the anticipation of the moment when all the planning would come to fruition. Even the neighbors seemed to sense that something was about to happen. Whispers circulated about how the protagonist had grown increasingly deliberate in their preparations, and some predicted a humorous twist that would leave Corinne surprised. The air carried a mix of tension and lighthearted curiosity, as if the street itself knew a small but satisfying climax was imminent. By the end of the week, the protagonist's preparations were complete. The trash can had been upgraded, subtly fortified, and positioned with a precision that only someone who had observed Corinne's patterns for weeks could achieve. All that remained was the next morning, when Corinne would arrive, clipboard in hand, expecting the familiar scene, and instead encounter something entirely unexpected. The stage was set. The protagonist, calm and composed, sipped their coffee and watched the sun rise, confident that their clever solution would turn a minor annoyance into a quiet, satisfying victory. And Corinne, eager and determined as ever, would soon be in for a surprise she never saw coming. The sun rose lazily over the quiet suburban street, casting long golden streaks across the protagonist's driveway. After weeks of observation, subtle adjustments, and careful note-taking, the protagonist felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. Corinne had been a persistent force, diligent and focused in her daily inspections, but now the protagonist had a plan, something clever, practical, and unexpected. The current trash can, while functional, had become the focal point of Corinne's obsession. Each morning, the protagonist had straightened it, sometimes silently laughing at the precision with which Corinne nudged it, sometimes making small modifications to test her reactions. But today was different. Today, the old can would be replaced with something entirely new, an object designed to withstand Karen's interference while adding a subtle hint of humor to the situation. The protagonist considered several options. A weighted base would prevent it from tipping, a slightly larger size might overwhelm Karen's expectations, and a design that appeared ordinary yet incorporated clever mechanisms would ensure the surprise was complete. In the end, they selected a trash can that combined practicality with a twist, sturdy, sleek, and self-stabilizing, with subtle design features that made it resistant to nudges or tilts. Neighbors passing by could see the protagonist carrying the new can onto the driveway, noting its unusual yet functional appearance. Some paused briefly, offering smiles and quiet nods of encouragement. They had been watching the ongoing trash can saga with amusement, impressed by the protagonist's calm planning and clever foresight. Everyone seemed to sense that the next chapter would be worth witnessing. The protagonist placed the new trash can carefully, aligning it precisely in the spot Karen had consistently targeted. A small weight at the bottom ensured it could not be toppled, while a slight internal mechanism allowed the lid to close smoothly and quietly. It looked ordinary at first glance, but any attempt to meddle would be met with subtle resistance, and the can would maintain its upright position. With the placement complete, the protagonist stepped back and examined the driveway. Everything was perfect. The flowers swayed gently in the morning breeze, the walkway gleamed in the sun, and the trash can stood firm, silently waiting for Karen's arrival. The scene was serene, almost theatrical, as if the stage had been set for a minor performance. Throughout the morning, the protagonist kept a watchful eye from the porch. The anticipation was quietly exhilarating. Karen was predictable, arriving each day at nearly the same time, clipboard ready to assert her version of order. But today, the familiar routine would collide with the protagonist's carefully constructed surprise. Karen appeared, walking briskly down the sidewalk, her heels clicking against the pavement in her usual determined rhythm. Clipboard tucked under her arm, she scanned each property with her sharp, assessing gaze. The neighbors, discreetly observing from their windows and lawns, exchanged knowing glances. They sensed something different today, though they had no idea exactly what. As Karen approached the protagonist's driveway, her eyes immediately found the trash can. She tilted her head, her lips pressing into a faint line of curiosity. Something was subtly different, though she couldn't quite pinpoint it. Confidently, she reached out and nudged the can. It wobbled slightly, just enough to feel familiar, and then it remained perfectly upright. Karen's eyebrows lifted in surprise. She nudged again, more firmly this time. The can resisted. She adjusted her stance, tapping the side lightly. Nothing. The trash can did exactly what it was designed to do. It stayed upright, functional, and unyielding. The protagonists sipped their coffee, a faint smile tugging at the corners of their lips. They had anticipated every motion, every angle, every tactic Karen might employ. The new trash can was not only functional but clever, and Karen's predictable persistence now met an unexpected obstacle. The neighbors quietly stifled laughter as they watched Karen's confusion grow. She inspected the can from every angle, tried different nudges, and even considered adjusting its placement, but each attempt failed. The protagonist, calm and composed, leaned back on the porch, savoring the moment. The plan had worked perfectly. This was the turning point. Karen's daily ritual had collided with the protagonist's ingenuity. For the first time, the familiar routine no longer followed the same predictable script. A subtle but unmistakable shift had occurred, and the stage was set for an amusing, satisfying encounter that would leave Karen flustered, neighbors quietly entertained, and the protagonist quietly triumphant. The morning continued with a sense of anticipation. Karen, still determined, tried various subtle tactics, but the trash can remained immovable. The protagonist, calm and confident, realized that the situation had now entered a new chapter, one of clever humor, subtle victory, and the quiet satisfaction of having turned a minor annoyance into a perfectly orchestrated moment of surprise. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and the soft warmth of the rising sun. From the porch, the protagonist watched as Karen approached, her steps precise, clipboard firmly in hand, and eyes scanning the neighborhood as if performing a meticulous inspection tour. Today, however, the protagonist felt a quiet thrill. A small, clever surprise awaited Karen, something that would disrupt her predictable routine and add a touch of humor to the otherwise ordinary morning. The new trash can sat firmly in its usual spot, upright and perfectly aligned, almost innocuous at first glance. Its sleek design and subtle reinforcements gave it an ordinary appearance, yet it was entirely resistant to nudges, bumps, or any small attempts at manipulation. The protagonist had carefully studied Karen's techniques over the past weeks. The angles she approached from, the timing of her pushes, even the signature tilt of her head when she thought she was correcting a problem. Every move had been anticipated, every subtle tactic countered by the clever design of the new can. As Karen neared the driveway, she adjusted her sunglasses and squinted slightly at the trash can. Something seemed different. Her fingers brushed the clipboard with a subtle hesitation, a flicker of curiosity passing across her face. She stepped closer, giving the can a gentle nudge with her foot. The trash can wobbled just enough to appear familiar but remained perfectly upright. Karen's eyes widened slightly. "That's odd," she murmured, tilting her head to the side. She tried again, tapping the side lightly with her hand. The can stayed in place, unyielding yet functional, as if silently declaring its independence. Karen straightened, glanced around, and even adjusted her stance to try a more deliberate push. Still, nothing changed. The protagonist, sitting on the porch with a mug of coffee, allowed themselves a small, quiet smile. This was the moment they had been anticipating, a subtle triumph crafted through patience, observation, and a little creativity. They sipped their coffee slowly, savoring both the flavor and the unfolding scene. Neighbors who had begun their morning routines now paused to watch. Some leaned from windows, others lingered on their driveways, all aware of Karen's predictable pattern but intrigued by the unusual rigidity of the trash can. Whispered comments circulated. "Is it me, or is the trash can not tipping over?" And she looked so confused. The protagonist quietly appreciated their audience, though their attention remained primarily on Karen and the clever setup that had finally come to fruition. Karen stepped back and examined the trash can from another angle. She gave it a slight shake, a firm push, and even a gentle kick. The can wobbled slightly but immediately corrected itself, standing perfectly upright as if it had a mind of its own. Karen's lips parted in surprise, and she glanced around, wondering if the neighbors were noticing her perplexity. A faint blush colored her cheeks as she realized her usual techniques were entirely ineffective. The protagonist remained calm, watching Karen's growing confusion with quiet amusement. There was no need for confrontation, no need for explanation. The clever design of the trash can spoke for itself. Every nudge, tap, or push Karen attempted was met with subtle, silent resistance. Her familiar sense of control had been humorously disrupted. As Karen inspected the can one last time, the protagonist stood from the porch, stretching casually. "Good morning, Karen," they said warmly, as if greeting her after a normal day. "I hope you're having a pleasant morning." Karen blinked, slightly flustered, but maintained her polite composure. Good morning," she stammered. Her clipboard felt heavier in her hands, and for the first time in weeks, she wasn't sure what to write down. The protagonist's calm demeanor, paired with the clever, unyielding trash can, left her momentarily speechless. The neighbors watched quietly, smiling and exchanging glances. Even from a distance, it was clear that the morning ritual had been disrupted in a subtle yet satisfying way. The protagonist had transformed a minor annoyance into a clever, humorous victory without saying a word or creating tension. By mid-morning, Karen, still perplexed, finally stepped away, leaving the trash can upright and entirely untouched. The protagonist returned to their coffee, savoring the quiet triumph and the satisfaction of having turned the ordinary into something unexpectedly delightful. Life at the street had regained its calm rhythm, and the stage was set for the next chapter, a combination of humor, cleverness, and subtle lessons about patience, creativity, and boundaries. Karen stood frozen for a moment, her eyes fixed on the trash can that refused to obey her usual methods. She had expected it to topple with a gentle push or wobble in response to a subtle nudge. Yet here it was, upright, perfectly balanced, and entirely indifferent to her presence. She tapped it lightly with her clipboard, nothing. She gave it a small kick with her foot, still nothing. A faint flush crept across her cheeks. The familiar confidence she carried during her morning inspections had vanished, replaced by an awkward mixture of curiosity and disbelief. For weeks, she had believed she understood the driveway, the trash can, and the rhythm of this quiet suburban street. Now that rhythm had shifted entirely under her gaze. The protagonist, leaning casually on the porch railing with a warm mug of coffee in hand, watched Karen's confusion with quiet amusement. Their smile was subtle, a mere twitch at the corner of the lips, but it carried the satisfaction of a plan executed flawlessly. There was no rush to intervene. This was humor at its best, silent, clever, and entirely self-contained. Karen circled the trash can slowly, trying different angles, each one more desperate than the last. She bent down, lightly tapping the lid and muttering to herself, it's different." Her usual list of complaints and observations had no foothold. The trash can, seemingly ordinary yet subtly engineered, resisted her efforts in ways she had not anticipated. Neighbors quietly observed from behind curtains, over fences, and from nearby driveways. A few suppressed chuckles, while others exchanged knowing glances. They had witnessed the escalating pattern over the past weeks and had been curious about how the protagonist would respond. Now they saw it, a quiet, clever victory that required no confrontation and no harsh words. "Good morning, Karen," the protagonist said lightly, their voice carrying just enough warmth to make the interaction civil while highlighting the humorous imbalance of the situation. "I hope the morning is treating you well." Karen blinked at the calm tone. Her usual confidence wavered, and she nodded, unable to summon the familiar force of authority she had once wielded over the trash can. Yes, good morning," she stammered, her clipboard now a little too heavy in her hands, a symbol of her temporary defeat. The protagonist leaned back, taking a slow sip of coffee, enjoying the quiet victory. The new trash can was not only functional but clever, resisting every poke, push, and prod Karen could muster. It was a small but perfect triumph, a demonstration of patience, foresight, and subtle ingenuity. Karen tried one last tactic, a gentle shake with her hands. The can wobbled slightly enough to suggest motion, but it quickly returned to its upright position. Her eyes widened and she let out a faint, almost inaudible sigh. There was no winning here. The protagonist had anticipated every approach, every angle, and every tactic. She could only step back, temporarily disarmed by the cleverness of the new arrangement. For the neighbors who had been observing, the scene was quietly entertaining. Some returned to their morning routines, smirking at the knowledge that the protagonist had managed the situation with humor and intelligence. Others whispered quietly to each other, "Well, that's one way to handle a persistent neighbor." Karen, after a moment of hesitation, straightened her posture and adjusted her clipboard. She gave a polite, almost reluctant nod toward the protagonist, acknowledging both the cleverness of the trash can and her own temporary defeat. Without another word, she walked away, her usual confidence stride slightly tempered by a new awareness. The protagonist remained on the porch, sipping the last of their coffee and enjoying the peaceful street, now restored to calm. The neighbors' subtle amusement lingered in the air like a quiet applause. The trash can stood firm, fully functional, and entirely resilient, an unspoken testament to the protagonist's patience, creativity, and humor. By mid-morning, the street returned to its usual quiet rhythm. Karen's retreat marked the first real acknowledgement that the protagonist had successfully shifted the balance. No words needed to be spoken. The scene had spoken for itself. The clever twist, executed with subtlety and foresight, had turned a minor nuisance into a moment of quiet triumph that would be remembered by all who had observed it. The protagonist leaned back further, stretching their arms, and let out a contented sigh. Life at the street had returned to calm, clever, and surprisingly humorous order. Their property, their trash can, and their peace of mind were fully intact. The street had settled into a calm rhythm by late morning, with sunlight streaming over freshly trimmed lawns and the occasional chirp of a bird. The protagonist stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, taking in the familiar sights of their property. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, the walkway gleamed in the soft light, and most importantly, the trash can stood upright, unyielding, and perfectly placed. It had become a symbol, not just of practicality, but of quiet cleverness and the subtle triumph of patience. Karen, meanwhile, was a few houses down, packing slowly along her driveway. Her usual confident stride had been tempered by the morning's events. For the first time, she seemed unsure, replaying the encounter with the unyielding trash can in her mind. Each nudge, each gentle tap, and each attempt at correction had failed. Her predictable routine had been disrupted, leaving her to reconsider her usual approach. Neighbors had begun to notice the shift as well. Some whispered quietly to one another, sharing small smiles of amusement at Karen's baffled expressions. Others gave subtle nods of approval to the protagonist, recognizing the skill and humor with which they had managed the situation. It was an unspoken acknowledgement that the careful planning, patience, and clever execution had not gone unnoticed. The protagonist moved about the property, performing light chores that now felt more satisfying than usual. They adjusted flower beds, checked the walkway for stray leaves, and even gave the mailbox a quick polish. Each task reinforced the sense of independence and control that had been tested and reaffirmed by Karen's persistent antics. There was no rush, no tension, only the steady satisfaction of a job done with care and ingenuity. Karen returned to her own driveway later in the day, attempting to engage the protagonist with a tentative wave. She approached cautiously, clipboard tucked under one arm, clearly weighing her words before speaking. "Good afternoon," she said, her tone measured and polite. "I wanted to check in, make sure everything is running smoothly." The protagonist looked up from arranging potted plants and smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, Karen. Everything is perfectly fine. The property is in order." Karen nodded, a small laugh escaping her lips. "I see. Yes, everything looks wonderful," she admitted, her voice carrying a touch of humility. The morning's events had clearly left an impression, and she was now navigating a new understanding of boundaries, patience, and subtle influence. Throughout the afternoon, the neighbors continued their routines, quietly observing the subtle shift in dynamics. Conversations arose about patience, clever solutions, and the art of managing minor conflicts with humor rather than confrontation. The protagonist's calm handling of the situation had become something of a model, demonstrating that observation, planning, and creativity could resolve challenges without tension or frustration. By evening, Karen had retreated to her home, leaving the protagonist's property undisturbed. The street felt lighter somehow, as though a small but significant lesson had been quietly absorbed. The protagonist, now back on the porch with the sun dipping low, took a deep breath and let the day's satisfaction settle in. The trash can, steadfast and immovable, seemed to reflect the calm and balance of the evening itself. Neighbors who had witnessed the unfolding events quietly shared smiles and humorous comments about Karen's attempts and the protagonist's clever solution. The moment had passed, yet it lingered in subtle ways, influencing interactions, conversations, and even the rhythm of daily routines on the street. As twilight approached, the protagonist leaned back, sipping the last of their coffee, and watched the lake of calm settle over the street. Birds sang their final songs, leaves rustled softly, and the air carried the satisfaction of a small but perfectly executed victory. Independence had been maintained, boundaries respected, and the humor of the situation had added a touch of joy to an otherwise ordinary day. For Karen, it had been a humbling lesson in patience and respect, delivered without confrontation but with subtle, undeniable clarity. For the neighbors, it had been a quietly amusing spectacle of ingenuity. And for the protagonist, it was a confirmation of the power of calm observation, clever planning, and humor in maintaining both peace of mind and property harmony. Life on the street had returned to its natural rhythm, peaceful, orderly, and quietly satisfying. The trash can stood as both a practical tool and a small testament to the value of clever thinking and composure under pressure. The morning sun spilled over the quiet suburban street, casting long shadows that danced across neatly trimmed lawns. The protagonist stepped onto the porch with a steaming cup of coffee, savoring the calm. After weeks of careful observation, subtle strategies, and a clever twist involving the trash can, the neighborhood seemed to have settled into a quieter, more humorous rhythm. Karen, meanwhile, approached the protagonist's property with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Gone was her usual brisk confidence. Instead, she moved deliberately, clipboard clutched tightly, eyes scanning the trash can with measured attention. Something had shifted in her approach. The morning ritual she had performed for weeks had been disrupted, and now she was navigating a new understanding of patience, boundaries, and subtle influence. Neighbors noticed the change as well. Some exchanged quiet smiles or whispered jokes about Karen's flustered expressions over the past few days. Others nodded politely to the protagonist, acknowledging the clever way the situation had been handled. It was a quiet celebration of wit and observation, without conflict, tension, or drama, simply the satisfaction of a small victory executed perfectly. The protagonist, seated calmly on the porch, observed Karen's cautious approach. She nudged the trash can slightly, then tapped it lightly with her clipboard. Nothing happened. The can remained upright, stable, and perfectly aligned. Karen's expression shifted from determination to mild disbelief, a mixture of humor and humility crossing her face. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that not every minor annoyance could be resolved through persistence alone. This subtle interaction became a quiet lesson in patience and observation. The protagonist had demonstrated that careful planning, creativity, and calm composure could resolve even persistent challenges without confrontation. Karen, for her part, began to adjust her behavior, approaching each situation with a bit more caution and respect. She tested her influence, learned its limits, and slowly recognized the value of clever solutions over forceful persistence. Throughout the morning, neighbors continued their routines, quietly noting the subtle shift in dynamics. A few lingered at windows or on porches, sharing small laughs about Karen's previous antics. The protagonist remained composed, their sense of satisfaction quietly visible in relaxed posture and gentle smiles. Each moment reinforced the understanding that patience, humor, and intelligence could achieve more than repeated attempts at control. By late morning, Karen had completed her inspection and stepped back, offering a polite, albeit tentative, nod toward the protagonist. "I see that everything is in order," she admitted softly, her voice carrying a hint of humility. The protagonist smiled warmly in return. "It certainly is," they replied, sipping their coffee and enjoying the simple satisfaction of a morning well navigated. The trash can, now firmly in place and impervious to further interference, symbolized more than just clever engineering. It represented balance, foresight, and the quiet power of creative problem-solving. It reminded neighbors, and even Karen, that small challenges could be met with patience, observation, and ingenuity rather than confrontation or frustration. As the day progressed, the protagonist attended to routine chores, adjusting flower beds, checking the walkway, and tending to the mailbox. Each small task reinforced a sense of independence and satisfaction. Life on the street had resumed a natural rhythm, free from tension and filled with subtle humor. The trash can stood as a testament to the value of calm and thoughtful action. Karen, observing from a distance, began to approach future encounters differently. She adjusted her timing, tempered her usual zeal, and approached each situation with greater mindfulness. Her previous insistence had been replaced by reflection and subtle respect, influenced by the clever yet silent lesson delivered by the protagonist's careful planning. By evening, the protagonist returned to the porch, watching the sun sink behind the rooftops. Birds sang their final songs, leaves rustled in the gentle breeze, and the quiet satisfaction of the day settled around them like a warm blanket. The trash can remained upright, functional, and perfectly aligned, a subtle symbol of the protagonist's ingenuity and composure. Neighbors moved quietly about their homes, some smiling at the subtle humor of the week's events, others reflecting on the value of patience and clever problem-solving. Karen had learned a small but important lesson. Neighbors had witnessed quiet humor and intelligence in action, and the protagonist had confirmed the power of calm, careful observation. As twilight deepened, the protagonist sipped the last of their coffee, savoring the serenity of the moment. Life on the street had returned to a harmonious rhythm, and the lessons of the week, patience, creativity, and subtle triumph, were quietly absorbed by all who had watched. The stage was set for peaceful, clever, and humorous days ahead. The morning sun stretched lazily across the quiet suburban street, casting golden light over neatly trimmed lawns and the familiar driveways of neighbors who were slowly emerging for their daily routines. The protagonist, seated on the porch with a steaming cup of coffee in hand, took a deep breath and surveyed their domain. The trash can stood firmly in its spot, upright, functional, and perfectly aligned, an unspoken testament to the patience, observation, and cleverness that had guided the past week. Karen approached cautiously, clipboard under her arm, her usual brisk confidence tempered by a hint of curiosity. She slowed her pace as she neared the driveway, glancing at the trash can with measured attention. The morning ritual that had defined her routine for weeks was now altered, reshaped by the protagonist's subtle ingenuity. She tapped the side lightly, nudged it gently, and tested it with a small push. Each attempt failed. The trash can remained steadfast, a quiet victory for its owner. "Good morning, Karen," the protagonist said warmly, lifting their mug in a casual salute. "Everything is running smoothly today." Karen paused, her eyes meeting the protagonist's. For a brief moment, she seemed unsure how to respond. Then a small, almost sheepish smile appeared on her face. "It certainly is," she admitted softly. "I see that you've made some adjustments." The protagonist smiled, a gentle nod acknowledging the subtle triumph. "Yes, just a few improvements. It's working perfectly now." Karen's reaction was a mixture of amusement, acknowledgement, and reluctant admiration. For the first time, she realized that persistence alone could not always dictate outcomes. Cleverness, patience, and observation had prevailed, and she could only respect the result. She gave a polite nod and retreated down the sidewalk, her usual authoritative stride softened by the quiet lesson she had absorbed. Neighbors who had quietly observed from behind curtains, over fences, and from nearby porches exchanged glances and smiles. Some whispered quietly to each other, commenting on the clever handling of the situation. Others silently celebrated the protagonist's calm approach and ingenuity, recognizing that the subtle humor of the morning had turned a minor annoyance into a source of quiet amusement and admiration. The protagonist, now fully enjoying the moment, moved about their property with renewed energy. They adjusted the flower beds, swept the walkway, and tended to the mailbox, all while maintaining a calm and composed presence. Each small task reinforced the sense of independence and satisfaction that had defined the week's events. The trash can, now more than a simple receptacle, had become a symbol of clever problem-solving and the quiet power of foresight. Throughout the day, the street settled into a peaceful rhythm. Birds sang, leaves rustled in the breeze, and the neighbors moved quietly about their homes, each subtly aware of the morning's small but significant events. Karen, meanwhile, had retreated to her home, occasionally peeking out of a window, perhaps reflecting on the lesson she had quietly learned. That patience, respect, and acknowledgement of boundaries could achieve more than repeated attempts at control. By late afternoon, the protagonist returned to the porch with a blanket and a book, enjoying the tranquil scenery. The sun's warm rays danced across the lawns, and the gentle hum of suburban life carried a sense of balance and satisfaction. The trash can remained upright, steadfast, and functional, a quiet monument to clever planning and observation. As the day turned to evening, the protagonist reflected on the events of the week. The encounters with Karen had been unexpected, humorous, and ultimately instructive. Independence had been maintained, boundaries respected, and subtle humor had transformed what could have been a tense series of interactions into moments of clever triumph. Karen, from a respectful distance, gave a small wave, acknowledging both the protagonist's victory and her own growth. She had learned humility, patience, and the value of subtle influence rather than forceful persistence. Neighbors quietly smiled, sharing a collective sense of amusement and admiration for the clever resolution. Finally, as twilight descended and stars began to twinkle above the quiet street, the protagonists sipped the last of their coffee and surveyed their property one last time for the day. Life had returned to its natural rhythm, peaceful, orderly, and quietly satisfying. The trash can remained upright, a small but powerful reminder of ingenuity, patience, and the calm satisfaction of handling life's little challenges with humor and cleverness. And with that, the protagonist settled into the porch chair, letting the serenity of the evening wash over them. The street was calm, the neighbors were content, and the protagonist's quiet, clever victory had been fully realized. The lesson lingered subtly in the air. Sometimes the best way to handle persistence is with patience, creativity, and a little unexpected cleverness.